So with these 4 functions, you basically know everything we'll need in this class. But I wanted to introduce you to a 5th basic element of programming, which we won't use too much in this class, but it's a really important concept in programming in general and part of what makes Python really powerful. And that idea is the object or class. So these are called classes or objects in different languages. And this is a kind of a new development in computer programming, only in the sort of modern times of programming. And sometimes you hear these referred to as object-oriented programming or OOP. And you'll hear languages described as OOP, which basically means that they support these type of objects or classes. And Python is an example of this kind of modern programming language that's object-oriented. And for example, classical languages like C did not support objects, but their new versions like C++ and C# do support them. And the idea of a class or object is a pretty powerful concept. It's basically a structure in which you can wrap both variables and certain functionalities and perform these functionalities within these objects. So it allows for the creation of much more complex software and programs. So I'll show you how to start to use these classes within Python. The basic definition of a class is similar to the definition of a function, but instead of def we use class, and then we specify the name of our class and a colon. And here, because a class is sort of a wrapper structure, we don't ever pass any variable specifically within the class, so we don't use this parentheses notation. And in the basic definition of a class, we can assign a variable within the class, and we'll call that 5. So here we specify the basic class structure, and within that class is just a variable called 5. So now we can assign versions or instances of this class to variables within Python. So we can have A assigned to instance of this class, and we instance that class just by saying its name and then the empty parentheses. Okay, so now if we run this in Python, we have A, which is an instance of my class, and we can ask A what the value of any of its variables are by using the dot syntax. So basically say A dot my value, and that will return 5. In addition, we can start writing functions within classes. So these functions will execute from within the class itself. And the syntax for this is very similar to how we defined functions before. Basically, we say def, and here we'll create a function called doPrint and colon, and that function will print a basic print statement. The only difference within defining functions within classes is within the parentheses, you have to by default pass an instance of the object itself. So because here we're defining a specific instance of the class, when you call a function, this class structure has to know which instance you're trying to execute that function on. So by default, you have to put the self in the parentheses, and if you don't, it will basically give you an error. So now if we run this script, and we can ask A to execute any function within its definition with the same dot syntax. So now we say A dot do print, and just like before, we have the empty parentheses because we're not passing any special variables into the function. And that will basically give us the print statement. So just like before, we can actually pass further parameters or variables into the function. So here we can pass a parameter called A, and then we can print that along with this print statement. Now if we run this, just like before, we can call the doPrint function, but because we're passing an extra variable here, we have to pass some kind of string into it. So I'll just print A and execute, and it'll print the basic print statement plus whatever is passed to this variable. So as you can see here, the self is kind of an assumed variable. You have to have it, but it doesn't count in terms of what you have to pass into the function. In addition, you can specify what's called an initialization function. So when you create an instance, there's a built-in function, and the syntax is basically def 2 underscores, init 2 underscores, and like always you have to pass a version of the instance into it, and whatever is contained in this function will execute as soon as you create an instance of that function. So for instance, if I don't want each version of this class to have the same value of this parameter, I can basically define a new value in here, and I can say self.myValue equals 10. So as you can see, because this variable is contained within the class, we have to tell it which class we're referring to, or which instance. So because we're passing a version of itself, any value we want to change within the class, we have to reference as self dot. So now if we run this, and we ask A for its my value, that value would be 10 because we changed it in this initialization function as soon as it created an instance of that class. What's cool about this is you can actually specify different values of the parameters to different instances of the class. So instead of having a 10 here, we can actually pass a variable into the initialization function to define what that my value is. So here we set it to that variable we passed. Any parameters you pass into the initialization parameter, you'll pass when you create the instance. So here we're creating an instance of my class called A. We're passing 15 into the initialization function, and it's getting passed in here, and it's being used to specify that my value function. So now if we execute this and ask A for my value, it'll get 15. So this init function is a standard function built into Python, and it basically runs whenever you instantiate a class. So now I can specify other instances of this class, and I can give them different initial values to this variable. So now if we run this, I can ask A for its my value, and B can have a different my value. So once you have this basic structure set up, you can actually have these variables, which can be different for each instance of the object, be expressed in the functions and be called by the functions within the object. So here we're specifying or creating 2 instances of the my class object, and instead of passing a parameter here, we're just going to print out the value of that object. So again, to reference the value of the instance, we have to write self.myValue. And now because this my value is changing for each instance, the function will perform differently for each instance of the object. So if we load this into the shell, now I can ask A to do print, and it'll return its version of my value, and I can ask B to do print, and it'll return its version. So that's the basic kind of setup of an object, and you can see how powerful the potential of this is, where you can actually wrap lots of data and functionality within these kind of objects and execute specific functions from specific objects. Again, we won't deal with this too much in the class, but I just wanted to give an introduction of how this works in Python, and potentially it can make your code a lot more powerful and easy to use. So that concludes a basic discussion of both the basic ideas and structures of computer programming languages and their implementations in Python. And this is important to remember because even though we're learning Python and its syntax for this class, these five ideas or elements exist in any programming language, and they really have to do with how you start thinking about structuring your code. And any code or software you want to write basically has to use one or a combination of these different elements. And I encourage you to look over the documentation for any further help you might need on specific syntax or how to do things. The Python website includes very well detailed documentation of anything you might want to do. So this has a lot of the things we already discussed, as well as a lot of more complicated functions and ways to work with data. You can also usually just Google anything you're curious about. So if you forgot how dictionaries work, you can basically just Google Python dictionary, and usually the first result will usually lead you back to this documentation, to the specific page that will be talking about dictionaries. So here you'll see kind of dictionary entry, and it'll give you all the information about how to use this. Okay, see you next time.